everyone, I'm Fiona Clarke from Harley Street Emporium and the Menopause Research and Education Fund. I'm a journalist with a science background who spent the last 20 years or so in medical publishing, and I am co-hosting this session today on skin ageing with the very lovely Dr. Clare Kiely.
Hello, everyone.
Who is a consultant dermatologist with a special interest in skin cancer, acne and scarring. She also has a master's degree in skin ageing and aesthetic medicine, is a member of the British Association of Dermatology and an executive board member of the British Cosmetic Dermatology Group, and also an honorary lecturer at the University of Manchester. Now, Clare loves a bit of research and has several articles published in peer-reviewed journals, and she's the co-founder of the Skin Diary alongside the wonderful guest we have over here, Professor Chris Griffiths, who is the Emeritus. Now, I say it Emeritus. You may say it differently, Australian accent, I'm sorry. Emeritus Professor of Dermatology at the University of Manchester, Adjunct Professor at King's College London, and a consultant dermatologist. He's received the Sir Archibald Gray Medal for Outstanding Service to British Dermatology and the British Society for Investigative Dermatology Medal for contributions to research, and was appointed an OBE for his services to dermatology. Not only that, he is also on the National Institute for Care and Health Research and an investigator and a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences. He's also the former president of the European Society for Dermatological Research, the European Dermatology Forum, and the British Association of Dermatologists, and the International Psoriasis Council. He's more than 800 PubMed-cited publications and is the editor-in-chief of the Rook Textbook of Dermatology. And he also happens to be the chief scientific officer at the Skin Diary. He has worked on psoriasis deeply, on topical retinoids, their management of photoaged skin. His work on psoriasis has been pivotal in understanding that it's an immune-mediated disease, which has led to treatments that have extended to other inflammatory conditions and even diseases like cancer. It's a great example of the butterfly effect in action, and his work has really changed medicine as we know it, and also the lives of people with psoriasis and inflammatory diseases. So, suffice to say, we are in very safe hands when we're talking about skin, because there's probably very few people on this earth who know more about skin and the way it functions than Chris Griffiths. So today, though, we are discussing skin ageing. And given that you've done so much work with psoriasis and inflammatory and immune diseases and those kinds of things, how do you reconcile that with skin ageing, which some people may look at it and think, there's a big difference between the two, between diseases and something that some people might think it's not so important, skin ageing. How do you reconcile the two?
Well, I mean, thank you for that very nice introduction. I guess the way I got into skin ageing was that I had worked on psoriasis, as you said, when I was a research fellow at St Mary's Hospital in London. And then to further that work, I went to the University of Michigan, ostensibly for a year and stayed for 7 years. And whilst I was there, and of course this is a good example of serendipity, which obviously drives a lot of medical research, you should take your opportunities when they come along. When I arrived in Michigan, they were just starting to do some of the very first work on use of topical retinoids, retin A, to repair photo-damaged skin, photo-aged skin. And I could see that was a potentially very exciting area. The area I was involved with was psoriasis at the beginning, which was to show that it was immune-mediated. And to be frank, no one believed us. And the same thing was happening in Michigan. They'd done the studies to show that topical retinoids could repair, reverse photo-aged skin, rejuvenate skin, and there was a lot of skepticism out there. So part of my role, was to investigate that further and to try and understand what the underlying mechanisms were, which were fascinating. So I'm sort of driven by understanding the underlying science, which can then help you develop treatments, whether it be for psoriasis or for aged or photo-aged skin. And so it's the intellectual side, which I think is very important, but also it's the opportunity to see how it translates into patient benefit or person benefit. So I don't think there's anything frivolous about photoaging. It does concern people. Studies we've done recently to show that older people in residential homes, they're very concerned about the way that they look and the way that their skin is behaving. Even though they feel young, they feel they don't look young. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do to try and improve their outlook on life.
I think, Chris, at the start of our Skin Diary journey together, you said something that was really quite obvious, but I found very, very insightful. And that was that you can't really understand how to treat something unless you really fully understand it at a cellular level. So basically, you can't make any inroads into developing therapeutic targets until you understand the mechanism of how the disease is developing. And that's the same for any skin disease, but also the same for aging and developing treatments for skin aging. And just looking back to the time when you were in Michigan, that was in the 80s, 90s, at that point, people probably didn't even know what a wrinkle was or how it was formed or why it was there. No. Can you talk a little bit about the research that was going on then?
Yeah, so I guess that the way this all started was there's one of the great dermatologists of the past 100 years, Albert Kligman, and he did this original work using topical retinoids, what became known as Retin-A, for treatment of photoaging, and started to describe the features, the histological features. They didn't really have molecular biology in those days or anything very fancy, but they could describe the histological features under the microscope of photoaged skin that has been sun damaged. And of course, it's only recently that we've started to be able to disentangle what are the effects of just chronologic aging that we're all susceptible to, and the effects of the environment, mainly sun damage. And of course, what most people are concerned about, if they're seeking help for the way that they think they look older, is because they're sun damaged. Mm-hmm. That produces wrinkles, that produces brown spots, which are a lot of what we view as being aging. Mm-hmm. And I think that at that time we had very little understanding of what causes a wrinkle. And we went back to basics and said, well, what's the main protein that gives skin its tensile strength and elasticity? And that's collagen. And is collagen affected in sun-damaged skin? Yes, it's reduced. Is that actually reversed or repaired or increased, or all of those, by topical retinoids? And that's what we looked at, and that's what we found. Mm-hmm. So you could then say, that there was a strong association between the loss of collagen, presence of the severity of photoaging, the wrinkles, and particularly wrinkles. And as they improve, you can see with topical retinoids, you can see the collagen synthesis start to increase. So that's really what led to an understanding of that's the key target, not just collagen, but other structural proteins such as elastic tissue and fibrillin.
You came back to the UK after working in Michigan for a while and set up a lab at the University of Manchester with a focus looking at not just inflammatory diseases but also photoaging and sun damage. Mm-hmm. And years back, we didn't really think that photo damage was that much of a factor in the development of skin cancers and things like that, but it turned out you were actually really quite ahead of the curve in looking at that. What did you find in terms of cancerous changes to the skin and photo damage in the precancerous ones?
Well, I'm not an expert on skin cancer. I guess that it's more... But when I came back to the UK, I was headhunted to set up a new department at the University of Manchester, which I started in 1994. And I took with me my portfolio of my expertise, which was around two areas of interest. One was psoriasis, and the other was, of course, photoaging. And I fully expected that when I got there that the interest in aging skin and photoaging would just go through the roof, exponential. But in fact, it's pretty much the same researchers 30 years later who are working on aging as they were then. It hasn't gone through the roof, and it's interesting why that is. Maybe it's because people view looking at aging and photoaging as not sort of serious science. Well, it's very serious science because what we learn from those areas can inform other less accessible organs. With the question around skin cancer, I think we know that it's not just ultraviolet radiation, ultraviolet light, sunlight. There's also other components of that can produce skin cancer. We know that maybe infrared is important. We know that probably pollutants play a role as well. So it's becoming much more involved and much better understood than it was then. So it's environmental change.
I think your research and your continued research in aging and photoaging, though, Chris, has been really kind of ahead of the curve because, now we are really waking up to the fact that there is an aging population. I read that the WHO said that our population over the age of 60 worldwide is going to double between now and 2050. So, that's phenomenal. So actually aging and skin-related aging changes are going to be a major health problem. Mm. And not only, as Fiona mentioned, obviously skin cancers are much, much more common in aged skin and in photoaged and UV damaged skin because you've just had more chronological years on the earth, so more UV exposure. But there's a big problem also with skin fragility and dermatoporosis, we call it in dermatology, but skin fragility where the skin atrophies and becomes so weak that, we see lots of patients where they get tiny little tears and that tear just won't heal, or just from minor injuries, even with a plaster. We see that a lot in derm surgery. So that kind of thing has major morbidity because those little tears then become infected and then cause major problems. So actually, skin aging is a huge health issue, and obviously the skin being so accessible, it's very easy for us to study it. So hopefully, even with these conversations, we will stimulate a bit more interest in skin aging and skin aging research. But as you said, a lot of the team in Manchester have kind of been pioneers with that, I think.
Yeah, that fragility is a really big issue. And when it comes to that, to the retinoids, we spend a lot of time thinking about the face, but we're not really thinking all that much about the body and that fragility.
Well,
of the
you're
skin.
absolutely right. So one of the sort of the key features of photoaging and aging in general is often on the forearm. Clare was saying their skin is very fragile. It's increasingly fragile because of sun exposure, which is why it's commonest to see these bruises. Called purpura. Bateman's purpura is the sort of scientific term for it, but it's easy bruising, and that's due to the increased fragility of the blood vessels because they've lost that sort of buttressing of the collagen, the elastic tissue around them, so they get damaged very easily, and they're more rigid in aged skin, and therefore less flexible, less pliable, and they break. And when they heal with these scars, so-called stellate pseudo scars. So it's a combination of these little cross-hatched of white scarring and the purpura. They just don't like it. And the question you're going to ask me is, of course, around can topical retinoids repair that? They can because they increase that collagen protective coating around the vessels, and also they increase the thickness of the atrophic or thin skin. But using retinoids away from the face is quite forgiving for topical retinoids. Using other parts of the body, the neck, the arms, it can be much more irritating.
Interestingly, with the fragility of the skin then, would we be looking then at if it's irritating on the rest of the body, is there not some way of mediating that irritation to make it much more palatable for skin outside of the face?
That's a very good question. I think we don't have a good answer yet as to why it is more irritating on those other areas. I think it may well be due to retinoid receptor density, could well play a role in that. It could be due to the increased vascularity of the facial skin, and also the sebaceous glands as well, all of which could ameliorate the irritating effect.
We see the same situation with laser treatments that we do on the face. So you can use much higher settings with laser on the face than you can do anywhere, kind of from the neck down. And we always just put it down to the fact that there's more of the pilosebaceous unit, or sweat glands on the face, so the face just heals better. Even with surgical scars on the face always heal much, much better than anywhere else on the body, which often surprises people.
Yeah, because you always think of it being the other way around, with because you always think, oh my God, the skin on the face is so delicate.
Yeah, but it's very forgiving. It's good, especially for derm surgery, because people always think you're great if you leave them with a lovely, nice, neat scar. But the skin is very good at healing itself. The Bateman's purpura that we were talking about, the patients really, really dislike it. So, because it is a real hallmark of aging. And, as Chris was saying, we kind of forget the fact that people in their 70s and 80s and 90s, they still want to look good and they don't like looking old. So it's often a question I'm asked in clinic. Good treatments for the body are something that we could do better with, I think.
Can we expect to see them coming from the Skin Diary?
Definitely, yes. It's all in the plans.
Yes, exactly. Because I guess if you start off with something that, at the lower, less irritating end, and then sort of you could build people up. Interesting. The other thing then about that with the retinoids and the sun-damaged skin is they apparently work better on sun-damaged skin. Why is that?
I think that was a paper that maybe yourself, or I've heard Rachel Watson speak about it, Chris, that the more photo aging that you have and the more photo damaged you are, the theory is that the more receptors there are, because the receptors are vitamin A depleted, and so that they're kind of primed to work when you put the vitamin A on.
We published that work a while ago now. Yes, no doubt that there's retinoic acid receptors are increased in photoaged skin in the epidermis. And it could well be because there's a relative deficit of vitamin A, retinoid in photoaged skin, and maybe even chronologically aged skin as well.
Yeah, it's one of the things I say to patients who are, again, more elderly and they say, well, skincare, what's that going to do for me? And I kind of say, well, actually, these vitamin A derivatives are much more likely to work in your photo-aged, photo-damaged skin than they are in young skin.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Which is interesting because we're now at that point in society where families, I mean, you have a young girl yourself, you are being targeted by marketing to think, oh my God, you need to go out and buy skincare for your, for pre-teens, tweens, I think they call them, or there's whatever a pre-teen is. And then this is probably really suggesting that you're wasting your money.
Yeah, I mean, I would think so. But you might not remember this study because I think it was back in the 90s, but it was yourself and Voorhees. You were looking at retinoids on intrinsically aged skin, so, covered skin, so say buttock skin, photo-damaged exposed skin, so I think it was possibly forearm skin, and then on babies' foreskin, which they get, of course, from circumcision specimens. And the retinoids worked on the intrinsically aged skin, the extrinsically aged skin, but kind of did nothing on the foreskin. So I wonder, is that because juvenile skin has enough vitamin A, it's replete with all of these nutrients. It does because it hasn't been aged, it hasn't been exposed to UV.
I think you're right. And I thought the other one of many fascinating things about retinoids is that they normalise a process. So if something is cells are proliferating rapidly, it will reduce it. As you see, as psoriasis, actually, we use oral retinoids, not the ones we use for photoaging, but oral retinoids for treating some forms of psoriasis. So you have a rapid proliferating cells in the upper layer of the skin. And then, of course, in photoaging or aging, there's a slowdown of production of collagen when it stimulates that collagen production. So it sort of brings things back. And if you're a tennis player, or it brings it back to the midline. If it's overshot, it brings it back. If it's undercooked, it brings it back. So it normalises what's either hyper or hypo-driven. And it could well be that in the foreskin things are just operating perfectly and there's no need to do anything. It doesn't affect it.
That's the scientific basis for not giving your children actives in their skincare routines. They need sunblock. That's what they need, sunscreens.
Exactly.
No disagreement on that one. The other, when you're talking about retinoids, there's a scale of them really, isn't there? We've got the sort of prescription grade tretinoin at one end and we've got the sort of retinol esters at the other, and each of them have their sort of pros and cons. In terms of irritation, how do you sort of get over that if you're using the ones that have a higher, like retinol I think has a higher rate of irritation than retinol, and tretinoin has a higher rate of irritation.
Well, you bring up a very
retinol.
interesting question here, and it's in a way dogs some of the research in retinoids over the years, because some people will say, well, the only reason you're getting benefit from using topical retinoids is because it irritates the skin, because dermabrasion is one of the sort of ways that photoaged skin is managed. It's not due to the irritation. We were able to show that several years ago now, when I was still in Michigan, we compared a clinical study, 0.1% tretinoin, which is the retin-A cream, which is the highest concentration you can get, against 0.025, quarter of the strength. And not surprisingly, the 0.025% retinoid cream was far less irritating, in fact, almost not irritating, but you got the same clinical benefit. It just took a little bit longer with the 0.025 because it's not so powerful. So that sort of means that you can divorce the irritation, or retinoid dermatitis, I would call it, from the clinical benefit. And interestingly, and not that I'm advocating this, but patients of ours who are on orally delivered retinoids for their psoriasis look younger, showing that it's an internal retinoid-driven effect and not an irritant effect.
Oh, interesting.
Which also, this is a slight digression, but just because a lot of the skincare industry treatments these days are based on either irritating or trauma. Have they got it wrong in some ways? Do you have to have trauma to get a good result?
No, I don't. They've not got it wrong. It's just a different way of approaching the same problem. And this is we know that by dermabrasion or laser resurfacing, you are stimulating those fibroblasts, which are the cells that produce collagen and elastic tissue in the skin, they're stimulating to produce more collagen and more elastic tissue.
The problem with those treatments from our perspective, is often the dermabrasion or the aggressive kind of ablative or fractionally ablative lasers leave people with other issues. You know, you can get very sensitized skin afterwards, and you know, you can even trigger things like rosacea. And I think there was a kind of a vogue for doing some of those very aggressive treatments in the 2000s, and there is less so now because of those kind of long-term sequelae that people have had after those. So I think, using things like retinoids in a non-irritating way for longer periods makes sense. Probably just instigating them a bit earlier and using them longer.
Apart from retinoids, you spend a lot of time looking now at other ingredients as well that are useful for anti-aging purposes. What have you been looking at and what have you found?
Well, over the last several years, my research in aging, photoaging, has moved towards intrinsic aging, because I think that's really where the sort of the nub of the problem is. And the huge advantage that we have in dermatology, as Claire's already alluded to, is that it's a very accessible organ. So we can do studies on intrinsically aged skin far easier than one can do studies on intrinsically aged any other organ. And by and large, if you take out the environmental influences, it's going to be similar processes. So we can start to really understand what drives aging in general. And I think that most of the big studies coming out now are looking at intrinsic aging, chronologic aging, that unfortunately we're all prone to. So I started to think about that and how we can prevent aging of the skin. And there are some exciting developments, because what we're seeing now with aging is becoming medicalized. The aging is now viewed as a disease. It was classified through the International Classification of Diseases, ICD, as a disease. Of course, that means that it has even more of a focus as to how you're going to manage that. And as a consequence, there's the medicalization. So there's senolytic drugs which are being developed, which will reduce senescent proteins in the skin and in other organs, which actually, drive the aging process. So you can prevent that. There are drugs which are being developed which stimulate something called autophagy. And autophagy is where, in simple terms, is each day the cells undergo a sort of spring clean and get rid of all the damaged organelles, constituents within the cell that are no longer working properly. And that's the process of autophagy. And we know there's certain lifestyle change and that can actually accelerate autophagy, make it work better. So the sort of things that your mother would have told you, sleeping more helps. More exercise, but not running marathons, but getting exercise every day helps. Having a lower calorie diet helps. And then there's certain medicines which can do this as well. One of which is metformin, being trialled in big studies in the United States now to see if that can actually improve biological aging and slow down the aging process. So there's a lot of interest now in what actually drives aging, what develops this senescence-associated secretory proteins or phenotype. And I think we're going to see far more drugs being developed now specifically for slowing down aging, so-called senolytics. There are some already out there which have been repurposed, if you like. They've been found to work in diseases such as leukemia, where they seem to also have an anti-senescence effect.
And with the metformin, what's the mechanism there? Is that it's a drug that you normally associate with diabetes. What's the mechanism for it in this respect?
I think in part it's due to autophagy, but there's quite a lot of evidence out there that it probably does slow the aging process. Calorie restriction helps, fasting helps as well. The sort of 5-2 diet, time-limited diet, all seem to drive that autophagy process. So lifestyle and behaviour change can play a big role. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really where we can make the biggest inroads rather than resorting to medicines. We can actually resort to getting people to exercise more, sleep more, do all the right things, eat the right foods. Mm-hmm. It makes a lot of sense. And of course, it's a public health message, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's not smoking and not drinking too much alcohol.
Yeah, exactly.
And not exposing your skin to too much UV, because that's also obviously the UV damaging the DNA in your cells, because the cells have to repair themselves and they can only replicate and repair themselves so many times. And that leads to these kind of senescent or zombie cells in your skin later in life that then all of those build up of the DNA damage in patches of skin then goes on to lead to more mutations, which can eventually become neoplasms or skin cancers down the road. So these are all these things with the UV and the environment and intrinsic aging all kind of linked together.
I think that's right. It's been very difficult to disentangle the two over the years, particularly in the skin. But one thing that we do know now, and is now becoming much more sort of front and centre of the research that's taking place, is that in aging there's an inflammatory component, so-called inflam aging. And you may know that a few weeks ago there was a very exciting study that was published with what's called a biologic therapy targeting an immune mediator called interleukin-11. And mice that had received this was the mouse studies, mice that had this antibody reducing their interleukin-11 levels, lived longer. That's important, 25% longer.
That's considerable.
But importantly, we're not just interested in lifespan, it's about health span. So how long are you healthy for? And interestingly, in those mice, not only did they live longer, but their frailty, their sort of impaired health, was also delayed as well. So that's almost the holy grail. So now there's a very strong interest in how can you prevent inflammation? What role does inflammation play in driving aging in any tissue? And we do know that in photoaging, there's a marked inflammatory infiltrate there. A lot of white blood cells are there in the skin, which shouldn't be there.
Yeah, so the inflammaging and the DNA damage and the kind of immunosuppressive state as you're aged all kind of leads to lots of different skin health issues, including the skin cancer and the dermatoporosis and all of it. I think it's probably going to be a long time before we actually have an oral agent or a systemic agent. There's probably going to be a lot of mice that are sacrificed in the meantime. But in the meantime, we still have our topical skincare that can really help. So a research article in the JEADV that I shared with you, Chris, it was one of Zoe Drelos, who's an American dermatologist with a very big interest in anti-aging skincare. But the top agents in topical skincare against aging and in reducing senescent cells are still the retinoids, vitamin C, niacinamide, vitamin E, so alpha-tocopherol, and these medium-chain hyaluronic acid.
Yeah.
So I used to just tell patients that hyaluronic acid was a moisturiser, because it's a humectant. But actually, when it's hydrolyzed and chopped up into these medium-chain hyaluronic acids, it does seem to really have an effect at a cellular level.
Because we know that in dermatoporosis that we've talked about already in this discussion, there's a deficit in hyaluronic acid.
How well does it absorb? Because this is the other thing in skincare products, is the difficulty of actually getting your ingredients to where you need them in the skin. So how do you ensure that you've actually got ingredients in your skincare products as well that are getting across that barrier that keeps them out and getting to work where they really need to go to work?
I think they've got to be a small enough molecular size. That's why you can't apply collagen to the skin and expect it, unless you're going to inject. If you're applying topical collagen, it's not going to do anything. It's too big.
Speaking of other things that you're doing up in Manchester, because you're looking at a lot of other botanicals and things like that, and I think you've done some, I believe Clare was saying, some amazing studies that actually show some of these are as good as the gold standard tretinoin. What have you been looking at? What have you found?
Over the years, I've done a lot of work on photoaging and aging skin, and been given advice to many companies about how to run their studies. And my colleague, Professor Rachel Watson, who was with me for many years in Manchester, is now directs the Skin Research Institute of Singapore. She and I developed an assay, if you like, to assess the utility of over-the-counter products. And it's very simple, is that we know that retinoids, retinoin, which is the gold standard, stimulates something called fibrillin, which is like elastic fibers high up in the skin, which are lost very early on in photoaging and aging. And we know that retinoids will stimulate the production of new fibrillin very quickly. And we were able to show that if you apply retinoids onto sun-damaged skin where there's already a loss of fibrillin under a sort of plastic occlusion, just for a few days, we've got retin-A can stimulate new fibrillin production. And so then we tested over-the-counter products in that to see whether, under the microscope, they would stimulate fibrillin. Some did, most of them didn't. And I think that's a pretty good readout. So when some of the work that we did, we showed that one of the over-the-counter products did actually do that. So on the basis of that, and that over-the-counter product did contain botanicals, I felt that we know so much more than the companies probably do about how to do this, that maybe we should look to try and develop our own skincare range. We got a small grant from the University of Manchester back in about 2009, 2010, proof of principle funding to see whether we could take forward our idea and develop it into a cream. And that had, amongst other things, it had botanicals in there, one of which was an extract of a plant called bilberry, which belongs to the myrtle family. Find it in moorland and hillsides, mainly in the west and the north of the UK. Small red purple berries which contain high levels of antioxidant. And we incorporated that into a formulation, tested that in this assay, and I have to say I was surprised, but it worked as well as topical retinoid without the irritation, stimulated collagen production in addition to fibrillin. So it's showing that you can actually develop something that doesn't contain retinoic acid, to produce a significant benefit.
Mm. There's a lot more research being done about the plant polyphenols now, and anthocyanins and flavonoids and their effect on skin. But another thing that you looked at was the lycopene in tomatoes, which is an interesting one, because there was a few studies going back on that. On their
and that's exactly right. So, of course, we talked about diet earlier on, and the Mediterranean diet is always held up as the paradigm of a healthy diet. And I think there's a lot of evidence to show that's the case. There's so-called blue zones around the world where people live longer with long health spans. Their diet, whether it be in Japan or Costa Rica or Sardinia, are very heavily weighted towards a Mediterranean-type diet with mainly plant-based diet. And, of course, tomatoes feature highly in these diets. And what is it about tomatoes that can have an antioxidant effect, protective effect? It turns out that it's in the skin of the tomatoes. The sad thing is, if you eat a raw tomato, it doesn't actually do you it doesn't actually improve things. But if it's in a tomato sauce or tomato ketchup even, tomato paste, then the active ingredient called lycopene is then released. And we did a study to show that people who are taking a lycopene in the form of tomato paste compared with olive oil as the control, their sensitivity to sun exposure or ultraviolet light exposure was reduced, implying that there is a protective effect there.
Well, that makes sense in places like Italy, where there's plenty of tomato paste pizzas and pastas in their diet. Yeah, so
it was interesting because we always think it's much healthier if you just pick it straight off the bush and it's raw and you eat it. But I went to the physics garden a couple of weeks ago and I didn't realise the same was for vitamin A in foods as well. You get a much higher dose of it if you have it cooked rather than having it in a raw piece of capsicum or whatever. Yeah, there's a lot about diet that's very interesting.
Yes.
I think diet is very, very important, but there's been very little research done on diet, and dermatologists as a group are not that well informed about diet.
Which is bizarre, really, isn't it?
It is bizarre, but I think it's because the data is not there to, there isn't the evidence, and we're interested in diet for psoriasis, intermittent fasting and Mediterranean diet. Yes, both of those actually improve psoriasis, interestingly, and I think that both of them would probably slow down aging.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm fascinated by the plant polyphenols because they do spend their lives exposed to UV. So obviously, like the bilberries that Chris has mentioned, they're packed full of antioxidants. That obviously protects them in a way from UV oxidization that they're, outdoors all the time. But also they have DNA repair enzymes that we don't have. And, there's so much actually that we can learn from plants. I think probably we have maybe disregarded it as a little bit kind of naturopathic for a while. But now that there's actually some real scientific evidence to a lot of these phytophenols and phytonutrients, I think that's probably where the skincare world is heading, but also for health and for disease prevention. I think we're learning a lot more about that. But I think we should definitely talk about the Skin Diary night repair therapy and the human trials, which Chris has done, which is fairly unheard of in our industry. Can you tell us a little bit about
so I sort of started to get into that in answer to your previous question. And so the product that we developed in Manchester, which was the night repair therapy, under another company at that time, which is now part of the Skin Diary, contained a variety of products, including the bilberry, as we've discussed. Trialled that on the the Manchester assay, where we presented this at scientific dermatology meetings. We published it in a scientific journal, peer-reviewed paper. It repairs sun-damaged skin, and it will probably improve, and almost certainly would improve intrinsically aged skin as well, because there are similar deficits in intrinsically aged skin, as you'd find in photo-aged skin. And then we did a clinical trial. Volunteers were using it topically, and we showed that there was improvement as well. So it's not just under that sort of rather contrived conditions under the microscope. Clinically, you can see a clinically discernible benefit. So, and it was, I guess, a brave thing to do, because one doesn't have to do a clinical trial as one would do for a new medicine for high blood pressure, for instance. You don't need to do that for an over-the-counter topical product for aging. Mm-hmm. But we did that because you want to have the highest level of evidence possible, which is a controlled study.
Yeah. Let me break that down a little bit. So basically, what we normally have is we will have people saying 8 out of 10 people said my skin looks so much better. Then we'd have what happens in a dish where we can say, okay, this showed a little bit of a change.
Yeah.
But you actually took biopsies and histologically showed that there was an improvement.
Yeah.
Was that what you
were doing?
So
we did that, showed that under the microscope there's incontrovertible improvement. And also we did a clinical trial where some individuals used the active product, the night repair therapy as it now is, and just an ordinary cream. There was a discernible difference between the two.
But not only that, they actually compared the night repair therapy to tretinoin on biopsy. So that, if the human trials were brave, then that was probably, a bit crazy actually to try and do that.
Yeah, and I think that we did do that because that's the gold standard, and that's the positive readout, and it worked as well as that. In fact, it was a little bit better. I hasten to add, because in that patch test study, the Manchester assay, in the short time course that the retin-A is applied to the skin, you don't see increase in collagen. We found an increase in collagen production with the night repair therapy. We found the increased fibrillin and elastic tissue, but this was different, which was really very exciting.
Over what period of time?
This is only a matter of about 12 days.
Wow.
But it's under occlusion, so it's driving it into the skin. But it's making a difference. It's showing it's different from just using an ordinary cream, a sort of a moisturising cream.
So this is kind of revolutionary for us, especially as dermatologists, because we're always being asked by people to recommend night creams. And we kind of just have a few that we rattle off, the ones that we think are probably good because they've got some evidence. But to have something that has this level of evidence in a randomized controlled human study from scientists that we respect is phenomenal, to be able to advise patients to use this. So it's really game-changing for dermatology.
It's game-changing. And also the other thing to remember about these studies that they've done in a blinded manner. So the individual looking at the readout, which is under the microscope, they don't know whether sample A is from, retinoid-treated skin, or it's the untreated skin, or it's the skin that's been treated with night repair therapy. They just read it as they see it.
So were they surprised when they got them back and they were saying, "Oh, I actually expected this to be the retinoid"?
Yeah, definitely.
Wow. Yeah. So the question is, how do you get that message out there?
It's difficult because
you're upsetting an apple cart in some ways, because we've got this whole sort of.
Well, I think the thing is, and we touched on this again earlier on, is that there's still scepticism out there about this whole business. Because, and it's unfortunate that the research on aging has been sort of subsumed into, rather sort of pseudo-science aesthetics. And I think that we need to separate what's been going on in Manchester and other big centres from what's going on in more commercially minded enterprises. Now, we were after the truth, the facts. If it didn't work, it didn't work. That's just the way it is. But this did work, and then it's our role to try and understand how it works. And this is completely different from what's out there. But of course, a lot of scientists and dermatologists didn't want to get involved with that sort of research because they thought it might be sort of viewed as sort of, not sort of mainstream. And that's why, that the number of researchers involved in skin aging research has stayed about the same over the years. I think it's changing now because we now have the anti-aging intrinsic aging products or understanding, and there's a sort of new interest now. And one of the drivers for that has been the amount of money that's coming in from people such as Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, these guys who, because they don't want to get old. Now, some of that money is not well spent, but some of the money, and I talked about that anti-interleukin 11 study, that did come from funding in that way from one of these commercial enterprises set up by one of these guys, and it is proved to be very, very interesting data. So there is some good science coming out of it now, and that's going to benefit not just us working on skin aging, it's going to benefit people who are working on aging in general. And that's going to, we've heard about, the percentage of the population that's going to be old or very old. It's more the very old and also the frail. We want to be able to prevent that because that's the biggest health crisis that we've got coming. Mm-hmm. There's lots of other things we've heard about, but I think aging and all the consequences of aging are a significant problem coming right at us. Mm. And if we don't address it and try and prevent it, and public health and things we've talked about are probably just as important, we've got a real problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not just the developed world.
No, absolutely. In terms of, if we're looking at the skin aging, the amount of, not just for getting old, but did you find also with these, and if you're looking at tretinoin, we'd also, we normally think of tretinoin with acne and the psoriasis as you were talking about, but did your bilberry also, did it have other effects beyond improving aging skin? Will it have other applications, do you think?
Well, we don't know is the answer. And I think that the other thing to remember about this is that it's not just one single ingredient in these creams. It's the formulation is so important. Mm-hmm. So it's like, the sort of old saying, it's greater than the sum of the parts. What they interact with each other, they synergize, they accelerate each other's action. And so if you took all the individual ingredients and tried them one by one, they might not work so well, but together they seem to be a very powerful combination. And it is likely that it may well be not just that the form, the way the skin looks that's improved, it's also the function of the skin, and that's what we're particularly interested in. Mm. So can you really restore or rejuvenate skin, not just that it looks younger, but it actually behaves like younger skin? I think that's very important. So immunologically, it's functioning normally. Mm-hmm. Structurally, it's functioning normally. That's what we'd like. So, we've got the whole well-being agenda. Well, having healthy skin is part of that. And that's what I think we at the Skin Diary are aiming for, is that you've got healthy skin.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. In terms of antioxidants and things like that, as you were mentioning before, the polyphenols, the antioxidants and things like that, people say, well, vitamin C is an antioxidant and vitamin E is an antioxidant. So what's the difference between one or the other? And do they have a symbiotic action working together?
They probably have a symbiotic action, I'm sure, working together. But I mean, if you think about our diet, we're taking in lots of different antioxidants. They say eat the rainbow.
So similar activity
similar
for the
thing.
skin?
I think so. I don't think, if you just had vitamin C on its own, it probably wouldn't do that much. It needs all its other cousins to have an effect. So I think we need all of these things on our skin, actually. And it's the same with your diet. Having a varied, healthy diet is good, and having lots of different antioxidants and minerals on your skin.
Yeah, I think it's evolution's been around a lot longer than the skincare industry. And I think that the way that our diet is evolved is to the individual's benefit. And once we start messing with that, with processed foods and everything else, that's when things start to get out of kilter. And if we go back to essential what our original diets would have been, I think that's where we're on safer ground. And that's where the fasting comes in as well. That's why that's helpful, because 200,000 years ago, or however many thousand years ago, there wasn't such a thing as one meal a day, even in one meal every 2 days. But that sort of fasting in between turned out to be beneficial because it stimulates autophagy. And then all these different roots and vegetables are beneficial, and that's why we eat them, because they all have different constituents.
Yeah, it all makes perfect sense, really. You know that eating a healthy diet.
It's sort of boring, but but by far it's the best thing to do.
Yeah. The other thing that is difficult, I think, is keeping the science as separate from the pseudoscience. I mean, not just in the skin aging, but also in the aging industry. We're seeing, we were talking about it earlier on, we're seeing a plethora of all different types of supplements and things coming along. And, because everyone wants to live a little bit longer and live a bit healthier, for longer. So there is a lot of pseudoscience out there. And I think for your average person on the street, it's very difficult to know the difference between what is real science and what is pseudoscience. And that's one of our challenges. I think that's one of the other reasons why we got involved in this, was to kind of light a fire in this skin aging industry that was led by dermatologists and led by the scientists, because it's, for the last few years, I've kind of felt like, and we agreed on this, that it's been much more of a commercial entity, that industry has kind of been leading on this. And obviously their goal is telling people to reduce wrinkles, and we're kind of thinking about skin health, and, the fact that wrinkles are being reduced alongside that is kind of a benefit. But actually, if we're just thinking about skin health, that's the goal, and that's where the science really should focus on now, I think. And that's why we're trying to engage other dermatologists and other skin scientists in this type of research.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of other things that you've been looking at in your labs, where you've looked at other ingredients beyond antioxidants and those kinds of things, ceramides, peptides, those kinds of things, how important are they in the formulation of products for skincare?
Well, they're important. Ceramides, particularly, we know that with aged skin, there's a loss of ceramide from the epidermis, particularly that's the upper layer of the skin. And peptides, there are certain shorter peptides which can restore some of the structure of the skin. So they're all important.
Mm.
Yeah, there's no one single fix here.
There was, you'll be interested in this, there was a study that you did on ceramides in menopause and how they're particularly, a certain type of ceramides are particularly depleted in postmenopausal skin. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, we always think about all of the other hormonal impacts when we were talking about estrogen and applying topical estrogen. Definitely applying your ceramides is a good idea.
Yeah, because one of the hallmarks of aged skin and photodamaged skin is, of course, it has a rather matte appearance. It loses that sort of gloss of youth, but also it's dry. It's dry, and with dryness becomes itching and pruritus, as we call it. And in older people, it's a major problem.
Yeah,
itching is the one dermatological symptom, but they have it more than anybody else. It's overlooked quite often.
And it can drive you nuts. Going back to your botanicals, I mean, you actually have you do charity work, you have an interest in botanicals, and you've done the Chelsea Flower Show. Why? How? What? Tell us about it.
I have an interest in global health dermatology, and I've developed that over the past 7 years and doing clinics, setting up clinics in refugee camps. And I had the great good fortune to go to Myanmar, Burma, with a colleague, friend of mine called Dr. Sue Lewin, who's a Burmese-born dermatologist who's now practicing in London at Guy's Hospital. And it's like a lot of meetings, you have a chat, not actually at the meeting, but in a bar. And I was telling her about the work I was doing on global health and refugee camps. And she says, well, each year I go back to, if I can, I try and go back to Burma, Myanmar to see my family. And I think there's a lot of work that could be done there. And, if we have the opportunity to go and visit some dermatology points, would you be interested in going? So went there, very poor country, one of the poorest, most fragile healthcare systems in the world. It's in the second worst in the world at that time. But some very bright, smart, young trainee dermatologists, but working in some very poor resource settings. And when we came back, we thought, well, we can do something to help here by working with them and set up a charity, which we called the Burma Skincare Initiative. And first couple of years, that got off to a great start. We had a lot of projects running, some research running. We organised the first ever international dermatology meeting they'd had in the country, and first ever meeting for dermatological nurses. And then COVID came, and then they had a military coup there 3 years ago now. And like with all charities, we're constantly looking at ways to improve the situation in that country. And one of the things that we set up was something called Essential Emergency Skincare, where we can no longer get into the country, not at the moment, but can you empower non-dermatologists to be able to recognise and manage common skin conditions? And if you think about it, most skin conditions around the world are not managed by dermatologists, they're managed by non-dermatologists, people with very little training, and we felt that we could train up people to do that, and we've done that. We also set up a teledermatology service in the country as well. So the opportunity arose to try and raise money for, and one of my interests has been gardening all my life. My mother was a keen gardener, and her family are a long line of professional gardeners. And Sulu and I were at the Chelsea Flower Show in 2021, and there was a garden there which had been a tribute garden to the Oxford University NHS hospitals for the work they'd done during COVID. And we both had the same idea as to why, this is such huge, publicity opportunity. Could we do something for the Burma Skincare Initiative? Long story short, that's what we did. We ran a competition with the London College of Garden Design to find a garden designer amongst their graduate students. Interviewed 3, great. We just wrote a sort of small brief about the charity, and they came up with their ideas. And the person we appointed was working for the BBC at that time. And she worked with us, designed the garden, and took that to Chelsea. We got it into Chelsea, which was quite a big deal just to get it to Chelsea this year. And not only did it get to Chelsea, but we won the gold medal and the best sanctuary garden.
Wow. Congratulations.
So it wasn't about botanicals. It was about telling the story of the work that we do with our colleagues in Myanmar, telling the story of how dermatologists, clinicians, doctors work with nurses and others to manage people with skin disease, and then raising the awareness about skin disease as well. So that was that was in May of this year, and we've just finished moving the garden now to its permanent home in a school in South London called Dulwich College. And we just finished that this week. That's
fantastic. Can people go and look at it?
Yeah.
Are they allowed onto Dulwich College to go and actually see it?
It's by the roadside, so you can see it, yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's so nice. Yeah.
It's a good news story, isn't it?
It is a good news story. We don't have many of those.
Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of good news stories then, the night cream.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When does it hit the shelves? Because this is an addition to your already amazing prescription level portfolio.
Yeah. So at the moment, we're hoping for October.
I think that's going to be a very exciting addition to what is already, a very bespoke range of products with a skin diary. I think the great, what you hear about in general medicine is stratification, personalised medicine. Mm-hmm. This is personalised skincare, but particularly targeted for the individual and their skincare regimens and their needs for their skin aging. And this is an addition to what's already proving to be very successful. Mm-hmm. And I think that what the general public particularly like about this is the fact that it's science-based. And I think we need to give much more respect to the general public, because they do get that this is something that's, these things work, this has been thought through, there's a scientific basis to it. And they can very easily discern whether it's what you were describing earlier. We used it on 8 out of 10 women. They said they felt as though their wrinkles appeared less obvious. This is much more than that. This is bespoke, clinically and scientifically driven research, and which has produced, I think, a great sort of regimen, great product.
Yes, although I guess on the other side of that too is, nearly every product now says backed by science, scientifically proven, and then but if you actually look at what's in it, it may show that, vitamin C works well at an L-ascorbic acid somewhere between 8 and 20%. Yeah. But, they'll have some sort of stabilised ester in it and say that, yes, they've got it in there. So, yes, it might have some form of vitamin C in there, but it's not the one that the evidence actually shows. So there's a lot of...
Or it's been shown to work in a test tube,
Yeah.
Which is not the same thing by a long way. So I think this is a new wave of skincare. Mm-hmm. And of course, dermatologists, as a general rule, not a lot of dermatologists know much about management of skin aging. So they're very happy to say, look, Skin Diary is, they know what they're doing. If you want, I can recommend that you talk to these guys and they can come up with a bespoke program.
Lots of different things that we're going to try and new things coming, including the night repair therapy and keeping it all very above board and at a very scientific level that's the goal. That's our North Star.
No, I think that's right. We're not going to sort of get swept away by any hype and hyperbole. It's just this is what works. This is how it's going to be.
One of the things that I get asked a lot, Chris, and maybe it's something that you can answer for us, is whether or not it makes sense that the way we do the retinoids and the Skin Diary, with the way we cycle through different products, if you think that's as efficacious as applying something every day, and if that actually works well.
That's a great question. I get asked that quite a bit by people. And you don't necessarily have to use things every day. I think it depends on the skin type and your tolerance And we know in medicines in general, I don't see why we should be divorcing, management of skin aging from management of other psoriasis, eczema, whatever else. And we know that management of psoriasis, for instance, which I know a bit about, is that quite often you start out with an induction dose of a treatment and then you bring it down to the lowest frequency of use, which is going to maintain that improvement. And it's no different from skin aging. Some people may need to use something every day. Some may just need to use it 2 or 3 times a week. As long as it maintains that improvement, that's fine.
Mm-hmm. I've found that it's just very variable for different people.
Yeah.
I think that's always what we've done in dermatology naturally. We've kind of tailored our dosing to suit individuals, and that's kind of what we're doing with this. We're tailoring the ingredients and tailoring the dosing and just making it suited to each individual. So it's very variable per person, but yeah, it kind of makes sense as to what we've just always done.
Yeah, it's the personalised medicine approach.
Yeah.
We're all different.
Yeah, it's interesting because earlier on you were saying that you got a quicker result with a higher strength of a tretinoin, but the other one did the same, but it just took a little bit longer. But we seem to live in a society at the moment where it's sort of like people think, oh my God, my skincare's stopped working. I must have a stronger and stronger and stronger dose of everything. But then really, from what you're saying, that's not really necessarily the case. I mean, do we get to a point where actually we're asking too much of what your skin is actually going to change?
I think it's consistency. I think you're right. People kind of want immediate results, and that's why a lot of people are turning to injectables and more invasive forms of cosmetics. But if you stick with a good skincare routine, I mean, the results speak for themselves.
Yeah, I think people are always looking for the quick fix. We're far more than the quick fix. We're sort of a long-term improvement.
Can I thank you both so much for joining us today? That was a really, really informative session that we've gone through. Chris, if people want to find out more about the Burma Skin Initiative, where do they find the information?
Just search that on the website, Burma Skincare Initiative.
And are there ways that you can donate on there?
Yep. There's a website there.
Brilliant. All right. And I understand you will be providing links to studies after this. If people want to download them, they can find them at the end of the podcast.
Yeah, at the end of the podcast, we can put links to some of Chris's research for anyone who wants to delve a little bit further into that. And if anyone wants to know more about the Skin Diary, you can find us at theskindiary.com.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.